Joining us now exclusively, Laurence Tribe, Harvard constitutional law professor. Professor Tribe, I want to get your overall reaction to the hearing today, but specifically to what we just heard from the president's lawyer. What does that open up? Lawyers have to be careful about what they say because of what it can open up on the other side of whatever contest they're in. Here he is, in effect, saying James Comey perjured himself today by testifying under oath to these things that he claimed the president said, which the president did not say. What now does that open up in terms of the presidency? Does that mean that the president now has to testify under oath himself?
Well, he certainly would resist doing that, but in a credibility contest between someone who seems to have no concept of truth and someone who has never been criticized as dishonest, it seems quite clear that Comey, who made contemporaneous notes and told the entire leadership of the FBI what the president had quite corruptly and improperly asked him to do in a context where the request was really an order. In that kind of contest, the president doesn't stand a chance. But of course, the president is not going to be put on trial in a normal criminal court. Sitting presidents are not tried for crimes. He can probably be indicted by a grand jury. That's never been tested. But the indictment would inevitably be handed to the House of Representatives, which would then have to decide whether to proceed with a bill of impeachment or several bills of impeachment. So this is deadly serious. As Comey himself said, the underlying facts about an alien power meddling in the very heart of our democracy and our sovereignty are bad enough. But to compound that with attempts by the president to interfere with the Justice Department's search for truth through the FBI is really to pile on things that are even more serious than what we saw in Watergate. So this is a real crisis, and it's a crisis that our Constitution has mechanisms for handling.
I want to get your reaction to something your colleague Alan Dershowitz said on this network earlier today. He's making the argument that it is actually constitutionally impossible to charge the president with obstruction of justice because he actually has technical authority and can order an FBI director to stop an investigation. Let's listen to what he said.
Well, I think Comey made a very significant statement today. He said he believed the Constitution authorizes the president to tell the director of the FBI who to investigate, who not to investigate, who to prosecute, who not to prosecute. He's 100% right about that constitutional analysis. So we have to get obstruction of justice off the table.
Your reaction to that, Professor?
Well, I like Alan. I respect him. I've long admired a lot of his work, but he couldn't possibly be more wrong. I think he's really forgotten some basic principles of constitutional law. The fact that the president has the power and the authority to do something is, of course, given to begin with. It's the abuse of that power that is the subject of impeachment proceedings and of the crime of obstruction of justice. Sure, a president can tell the FBI, I don't want you to waste resources prosecuting people for mere possession of controlled substances. But what he can't do is tell the director of the FBI, I don't want you to go after my friends or to go after my national security advisor, even if it turns out that he helped me collude with Russia to undermine our democracy so that I could get richer. I mean, abusing power, corruptly using it, that's the essence of obstruction. So much as I admire Alan Dershowitz, I think he's completely off base on this.
And abuse of power was one of the elements that was being developed by the House of Representatives against President Nixon in their bill of impeachment when President Nixon resigned rather than face that trial.
That's right. And the abuse in that case was remarkably similar to this. Nixon rather than himself telling the FBI to lay off, was a little chicken about it. He essentially told the CIA director and others to lean on the FBI. Well, apparently, very much the same happened here. We have reason to believe that President Trump told Dan Coats and told Admiral Rogers to reinforce his threat to the FBI director by telling the FBI director to lay off of Flynn. And of course, we know that he directly fired Comey, lying about the reasons, and he did it because of the Russia investigation. And he also abused his power in lying about the reasons. That is, when Director Comey, who's a mild-mannered man who does not call someone a liar easily, when he said that the president lied in saying the FBI was in shambles, he added that the president defamed the FBI, undermined that vital national institution, just as the president lied about President Obama, not only about the birth certificate, but pretending that Obama had wiretapped him. I mean, this guy is willing to throw his weight around and his power around, and that's an abuse of power. It's really a remarkable thing. In this context, the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. You've got a little obstruction of justice here, a little there. You have the abuse of power by defaming the FBI. You have a kind of bribing situation with a guy who wants to stay as director of the FBI, and the president, who has told him repeatedly, yes, I'm glad to have you, whispered in his ear, I want to work with you, then dangles above his head the sword of Damocles, saying, but I'm going to get rid of you unless you plead loyalty to me. I mean, the entire thing is just a dramatic imbroglio.
Harvard Law Professor Laurence Tribe, real honor to have you be our leadoff guest on this very important night. It's been a real honor for me. Thank you, Professor.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.